Trump Jr. infiltrates the CIA archives. The truth about his father's Moscow visit stuns Washington. Donald Trump Jr. stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his Manhattan apartment. Dark circles shadowed his eyes after weeks of sleepless nights. The stolen CIA security badge sat heavy in his suit pocket, $50,000 worth of plastic, and electronics that would either get him arrested or finally uncover the truth. "You sure about this?" his longtime security advisor Mike Reeves asked from the doorway. The ex-Secret Service agent had tried to talk him out of it for months. "What choice do I have?" "Mike," Don Jr. splashed cold water on his face. 10 years. 10 years of watching them destroy my father with lies about Moscow, while he sits there in Mar-a-Lago, dying inside, knowing he can't prove his innocence. "There are other ways. We tried the other ways," Don Jr. snapped, gripping the marble counter. "The FOIA requests, the lawsuits, the private investigators, they blocked us at every turn. Someone in there knows the truth, and they've buried it deep." Mike stepped into the bathroom, lowering his voice. "Think about your kids, Don. If this goes wrong, I'm thinking about my kids." Don Jr.'s voice cracked. "You think I want them growing up believing their grandfather was a Russian asset? That their whole family legacy is built on treason?" The security advisor sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. He'd been with the Trump family since the White House years, watched them weather scandal after scandal. But this was different. This was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "The source is solid?" Mike asked for the 100th time. Don Jr. nodded, straightening his tie. "David Chen, Jr. CIA analyst. Gambling debts had him desperate. He gave us everything: building layout, security patterns, exact location of the Moscow files. And you trust him?" "I trust that he's more afraid of his bookies than the CIA." Don Jr. checked his watch. 7:45 p.m. He said the night shift change happens at 8. That's our window. The drive to Langley was silent. Don Jr. watched the Virginia suburbs blur past, mind racing through everything that could go wrong. Best case, he finds proof of his father's innocence. Worst case, federal prison. Either way, his life changed tonight. The CIA headquarters loomed ahead, a sprawling concrete complex swimming in floodlights. Don Jr.'s heart hammered as Mike pulled into the visitor lot. "Last chance to back out," Mike said quietly. Don Jr. thought of his father's face the last time they'd spoken. The defeated slump of his shoulders, the way his voice shook when he said, "Maybe they're right about me, son. Maybe I just can't remember." "No." Don Jr. grabbed his briefcase. "We do this tonight." The security entrance was exactly as Chen described, to guards rotating shifts at 8 p.m. Don Jr. approached confidently, flashing the stolen badge. "Evening." He nodded to the guards. "David Chen, Analysis Division." Pulling another late one. The older guard barely glanced at the badge before waving him through. The younger one frowned slightly. "Haven't seen you around before, Mr. Chen." Don Jr.'s stomach clenched. "Just transferred from the Chicago office last month. Still learning my way around." A tense moment passed. Then the young guard shrugged. "Welcome aboard. Make sure you sign the overnight log." Don Jr. scrawled Chen's signature in the book, forcing his hand steady. The elevator required another badge swipe. Level B3, Records Division. The doors opened to a maze of fluorescent-lit corridors. His phone buzzed, a text from Mike waiting. In the car, security shift complete. You have 45-minute max. Following Chen's map, Don Jr. navigated the identical hallways, left, right again. His designer shoes echoed on the linoleum. A few late working analysts barely glanced up as he passed. The archives section was marked by heavy steel doors. Another badge swipe. Don Jr.'s pulse roared in his ears as the lock clicked green. The room beyond was massive, rows of servers and file cabinets stretching into shadow. The air hummed with cooling fans. Chen's instructions were specific. Terminal 47. Password Corvus 1995. Don Jr. found the workstation tucked in a back corner. His fingers trembled as he typed the password. The screen flashed red. Access denied. No. He tried again. Red screen. A voice behind him. "Need some help with that." Don Jr. spun to face a middle-aged woman in a cardigan. her CIA badge. Read Margaret Wells, Senior Archivist. Don Jr. scrambled for a cover story. System seems to be giving me trouble. Margaret tilted her head, studying him. Funny. I know everyone cleared for this section. But I don't know you, Mr. Chen, is it? I spread through Don Jr.'s veins. Had Chen set him up? Just transferred. He managed. Chicago office. Really, Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. Because I just had lunch with the real David Chen. Nice kid. About half your age. And definitely Asian. Don Jr.'s mind raced. Run, fight, try to bribe her. Before he could decide. Margaret reached for her phone. Wait, Don Jr. held up his hands. Please, just hear me out. Why should I? Because you know who I am. And you know why I'm here. Margaret's hands stayed on her phone. But she didn't dial. My father, Don Jr.'s voice cracked. Everything they said about Moscow, the collusion, the blackmail, it's killing him. He's not the man he was. I need to know the truth. Even if the truth isn't what you want to hear. Especially then. Don Jr. met her eyes. Please, help me understand what really happened that night. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Don Jr. held his breath. Everything hinged on this woman's next move. Finally, she sighed. Your father, he wasn't what they said he was. But the truth, it's complicated. What do you mean? Margaret glanced at the security cameras. Not here. Follow me. She led him deeper into the archives, past rows of locked cabinets to a small office. The nameplate read M. Wells, Chief Archivist. Sit. She closed the door. You have 15 minutes before the next security sweep. After that, you were never here. Understood? Don Jr. nodded, heart pounding. Margaret unlocked a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled Moscow Protocol, 2013. Your father's trip to Moscow, she began, wasn't what anyone thought. Not the media, not the Russians, not even him. She spread photos across the desk. Trump and the Moscow Ritz, meeting oligarchs. The infamous pageant. The CIA had been planning something big. An extraction. Top-level Russian asset, codename Nightingale. But we needed cover, something flashy enough to keep all eyes looking the wrong way. Don Jr. leaned forward. My father was the distraction, the perfect distraction. A controversial American billionaire hosting his pageant in Moscow. Everyone watched him, which let us slip Nightingale out right under the FSB's nose. Did he know? Was he working with you? Margaret shook her head. Complete coincidence. Your father was just doing what he always did. Chasing publicity and business. Deals. We simply took advantage of the opportunity. Then why not clear his name later? Why let everyone believe? Because sometimes a lie serves better than the truth. Margaret's voice was gentle. If we admitted using his visit as cover, it would have exposed the whole operation. Nightingale. Other assets. We couldn't risk it. Don Jr. sat back, mind reeling. So you let them destroy him. Let them call him a traitor, when all along, politics is cruel. Margaret gathered the photos. But your father was never a Russian agent. Just a businessman who accidentally helped America more than he'll ever know. A distant door slammed. Margaret tensed. Security sweep. You need to go. Now. Don Jr. stood, desperate for more answers. Wait, there has to be proof. Documentation. Something I can asterisk. No copies. No evidence. Margaret's tone was final. The truth stays buried. For everyone's safety. She led him to a side exit, checking the corridor. Go, and Mr. Trump, your father, may not be able to clear his name, but at least you know he served his country, even if he never meant to. Don Jr. hurried through the empty halls, mind spinning. His phone buzzed. Mike, security alert. Get out now. He quickened his pace. Badge. Ready. Almost there. Just had to make it past the front desk. Hey, stop right there. Don Jr. broke into a run as footsteps pounded behind him. The exit was ahead. Heart thundering, lungs burning, he burst through the doors into the night air. Mike's car screeched. Up. Don Jr. dove into the passenger seat as shouts echoed from the building. Drive. He gasped. Mike floored it, tires squealing. Don Jr. slumped in his seat, breathing hard. No documents. No proof. Just the word of an archivist who might deny everything tomorrow. But he knew the truth now. His father, an unwitting patriot rather than a traitor. The irony was almost too much. His phone rang, Mar-a-Lago's number. "Son," his father's voice was thin with worry. "The CIA just called, said there was a break-in." That someone claiming to be David Chen. Don Jr. closed his eyes as they sped into the night. "Dad, we need to talk. About Moscow. About everything. Some truths changed everything. Even if they could never be proven." Mike steered them onto the highway as emergency vehicles screamed past in the opposite direction. Don Jr. watched their lights fade, knowing his life would never be the same. But for the first time in years, the weight of uncertainty had lifted. His father was no traitor, just a man caught in forces beyond his control. Now Don Jr. carried a different burden, a truth that could never see light. As Washington's monuments disappeared behind them, he touched the stolen badge in his pocket. One final reminder of the night everything changed. The truth about Moscow was safe in its CIA vault, but Donald Trump Jr. finally had the answer he'd sought for so long. For now, that would have to be enough. As they sped through the Virginia night, Don Jr.'s phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls from his siblings, his lawyers, even reporters who'd somehow already caught wind of the incident. "You need to ditch that phone," Mike said, taking a sharp turn onto a back road. "They'll be tracking it." "Not yet." Don Jr. stared at the screen as another call from Mar-a-Lago lit up. "I have to talk to him first." "Don, think this through. The less he knows, he deserves to know." "Mike." Don Jr. slammed his fist on the dashboard. 10 years of thinking he might be going crazy. That maybe he really did do something in Moscow and just couldn't remember. 10 years of watching his grandkids grow up wondering if their grandfather was a traitor. The phone kept ringing. With trembling fingers, Don Jr. answered. "Dad, Jr." His father's voice was strained. "The CIA director just called me personally. Said someone broke into their archives. Used some analyst's stolen credentials. They're saying it was you." Don Jr. closed his eyes. "Dad, listen to me. Tell me you didn't do it." The desperation in his father's voice was painful to hear. "Tell me you didn't risk everything just because of those old Moscow rumors." "I had to know the truth." A long silence. Then, "What truth?" "Son, whatever you think happened that night, you were used, Dad. The whole trip, the pageant, the meetings, all of it. The CIA used it as cover for some big operation. Extracting a Russian asset or something." "What are you talking about?" "I met someone inside. An archivist. She showed me files, photos. You weren't working with the Russians. You were accidentally helping American intelligence. And they let everyone believe the worst about you to protect their operation." Another silence. When his father spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "You're sure about this? I saw the proof with my own eyes. You're no traitor, Dad. You never were." A choked sound came through the phone, something between a laugh and a sob. "All these years, I started to think maybe they were right. Maybe I had done something and just couldn't." "I know, Dad. I know." Don Jr. wiped his eyes. "But it's over now. We know the truth we can never prove." His father's voice hardened. "Son, they're coming for you. The FBI, CIA, everyone. This isn't going away. I know. Whatever happens next, whatever they try to do to you, remember I love you. And I'm proud of you." Don Jr.'s throat tightened. "Love you too, Dad." The call ended. Mike glanced over. "We need a plan. Somewhere to lay low until a helicopter thundered overhead, searchlights sweeping the road. Red and blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror. Too late. Don Jr. said quietly. Mike's hands tightened. "On the wheel. I can try to lose them. I know some back roads." "No." Don Jr. straightened his tie. "No more running. Pull over. Don, pull over." "Mike, it's okay." The car slowed. Gravel crunching as they stopped on the shoulder. The helicopter spotlight pinned them in harsh white light as police cars surrounded them. "Hands where we can see them." Voices shouted through megaphones. Don Jr. raised his hands slowly. Through the glare, he could see FBI jackets, drawn weapons. This was it, the moment his life changed forever. But as agents approached the car, he felt strangely calm. The truth about Moscow was still locked away in those CIA files. But he knew now. His father knew. Sometimes that had to be enough. Donald Trump Jr., an agent announced, opening his door, "You're under arrest for espionage, theft of government property, and unauthorized access of classified materials." As they handcuffed him, Don Jr. caught Mike's anguished look. "It's okay," he said again. "Call my lawyers and tell my father. Tell him to hold on to the truth." They led him to a waiting SUV as media vans began arriving, cameras flashing. Tomorrow, this would be everywhere. Another Trump scandal, another black mark on the family name. But this time was different. This time he carried a secret that changed everything, even if the world would never know. The SUV door slammed shut. As they drove away, Don Jr. watched the chaos fade behind them. He'd found what he came for. Now he just had to face what came. Next, the beginning of a very different kind of fight was about to begin. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the FBI interrogation room. Don Jr. had been there for 6 hours, still in his wrinkled suit from the night before. His lawyer, Alan Morrison, sat beside him, furiously taking notes. For the last time, FBI agent Sarah Coleman said, "Who gave you access to the CIA facility?" Don Jr. rubbed his temples. "And for the last time, I want to speak to someone with proper clearance. What I found in those archives, it's bigger than you know." "Mr. Trump," Coleman leaned forward, "you're facing decades in federal prison. This isn't about your father's Moscow trip anymore. This is about—" A sharp knock interrupted her. A man in a dark suit entered, whispering something in Coleman's ear. Her eyes widened. "We're done here," she announced abruptly, gathering her files. "Done?" Morrison asked. "What do you mean done? My client has been here all night." The lawyer protested. "You can't just—" "Your client," a new voice said from the doorway, "is coming with us." 2 men in suits entered, one older with silver hair, the other younger with a military bearing. Both carried CIA credentials. "I'm Deputy Director Wilson," the older man said. "This is Agent Brooks. Mr. Trump, we need to discuss what you saw on our archives." Morrison stood. "My client isn't saying anything without. Your services are no longer required." Wilson cut him off. "This is now a matter of national security. You'll be contacted by our legal team. It's okay." "Alan," Don Jr. said quietly, "I'll call you later, after." The lawyer left. Wilson sat across from Don Jr. "That was quite a performance you gave last night. Our security systems caught everything, including your conversation with Margaret Wells." Don Jr.'s stomach tightened. "Is she currently being debriefed?" Wilson's face revealed nothing. "The question is, what exactly did she show you?" "You already know. You've got it all on camera." "Humor me." Don Jr. studied the men carefully. "She showed me files about Moscow, about how he used my father's trip as cover for extracting some Russian asset. Codename Nightingale." Brooks and Wilson exchanged looks. "And why?" Wilson asked. "Do you think she chose to share that information because it was the truth? Because she was tired of seeing my father destroyed by lies?" Wilson smiled thinly. "Margaret Wells has been with the agency for 30 years. She's one of our most trusted archivists. Do you really think she'd risk her career just to ease your father's conscience?" A cold feeling crept through Don Jr.'s chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Wilson leaned forward, "that perhaps you should consider why you were allowed to see exactly what you were looking for." "Allowed to?" Don Jr.'s mind raced. "No, the security badge, the passwords. I bought those from Chen, David Chen." Brooks spoke for the first time. "The analyst who mysteriously developed a gambling problem 3 months ago, who suddenly had access to information far above his clearance level." Don Jr.'s mouth went dry. "You set me up. We created a path," Wilson corrected. "One we knew you'd eventually take. Your dedication to clearing your father's name made you predictable. But why? Why show me any of it if you were just going to arrest me?" Wilson opened a folder. "Because what Margaret showed you was only part of the story, the part we wanted you to see. The real files about Moscow, those paint a very different picture." He slid a document across the table. Don Jr.'s blood ran cold as he read the first page. "That's impossible," he whispered. The other files were carefully crafted fiction, a trail of breadcrumbs designed to lead you exactly where we needed you to go. I don't understand. What do you want from me? Wilson closed the folder. Your father is considering another presidential run. Despite everything, he still commands loyalty from millions. But he's also a man haunted by Moscow, by gaps in his memory he can't explain. Now his son has discovered evidence that appears to clear his name. You want me to tell him? Don Jr. realized, to convince him the lie you showed me was the truth. Think of it as a patriotic duty. Your father gets peace of mind. The country gets stability. Everyone wins. And if I refuse, then we release the real files. Wilson's voice hardened. The ones that show exactly what happened in that Moscow hotel room. The ones that would destroy not just your father's legacy, but your entire family's future. Don Jr. felt sick. You're bluffing. If you had proof like that, you'd have used it years ago. Would we? Sometimes having leverage is more valuable than using it. Wilson stood. You have 24 hours to decide. Choose wisely. They left Don Jr. alone with the file. His hands shook as he read deeper into the true Moscow documents. Each page felt like another knife in his gut. Hours passed. Finally, Brooks returned. Time to go. He announced, a car's waiting to take you home. I haven't decided yet, Don Jr. said. Yes, you have. Brooks almost looked sympathetic. Because you know what happens if you don't play along. And you know your father's enemies would love nothing more than for those files to go public. In the car, Don Jr. watched Washington pass by in a blur. His phone had been returned. Dozens of missed calls from family, lawyers, media. One text from his father. Whatever they showed you, whatever they say, I trust you, son. Don Jr. closed his eyes, the weight of impossible choices crushing down. He'd gone looking for truth and found only deeper lies. Now he had to decide, protect his father with comforting fiction, or risk destroying him with facts. The car turned onto his street as his phone buzzed again. Mar-a-Lago calling. It was time to choose. The car pulled up to Don Jr.'s building as the sun was setting. His phone kept ringing, Mar-a-Lago's number flashing insistently. Remember, Brooks said from the front seat, 24 hours, and Mr. Trump, don't try anything clever. We're watching. Inside his apartment, Don Jr. found Mike waiting. The security advisor looked like he hadn't slept. Jesus Christ, Don, Mike stood. I've been calling everywhere. What happened? What did they not hear? Don Jr. pointed to his ears, then to the walls. Mike nodded. Understanding. They walked to Central Park in silence. Only when they reached a crowded playground did Don Jr. feel safe to talk. It was a setup, he said quietly. Watching children on the swings. All of it. Chen, the badge, even that archivist. The CIA played me like a fiddle. Why? Don Jr. laughed bitterly. To control the narrative. They showed me exactly what they wanted me to see. Files claiming Dad was some unwitting patriot. Then, they revealed the real documents. How bad? Bad enough to end everything. Not just his political future, everything. The Trump name would become poison. Mike cursed under his breath. What do they want? They want me to sell their fake story. To my father. Make him believe he was a hero instead of. Don Jr.'s voice cracked. They know he's thinking of running again. This way they control him, without having to expose anything. And if you refuse, then the real files go public. Don Jr. watched a father pushing his daughter on a swing. Everything. We built, everything we are, gone. His phone rang again. Mar-a-Lago, you have to answer eventually. Mike said. Don Jr. stared at the screen. How do I tell him? How do I look my father in the eye and either lie to him or destroy him? Maybe there's another way. We could go public first. Get ahead of. They've thought of everything. Mike, any move we make, they've got contingencies. Don Jr. stood, pacing. Christ. They manipulated me into breaking into their own archives just so they'd have leverage. So what's the play? Before Don Jr. could answer, his phone buzzed with a text. Unknown number. Time's wasting. Mr. Trump, your father's waiting. They're watching us right now. He muttered, showing Mike the message. Of course they are. Mike scanned the park. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Don Jr. thought about his father sitting in Mar-a-Lago, waiting for answers. About his children who would inherit whatever choice he made today. About truth and lies and the price of both. I need a secure line. he said finally. Something they can't monitor. Mike nodded. I know a guy, XNSA. Give me an hour. 1 hour. Don Jr. checked his watch. Then I make the hardest call of my life. They split up, Mike to arrange the secure phone, Don Jr. back to his apartment to think. But as he approached his building, a familiar face was waiting. Margaret Wells. The CIA archivist sat on a bench, feeding pigeons. Walk with me, Mr. Trump. Why? So you can feed me more lies? Because there's something you need to understand about those files they showed you today. Don Jr. hesitated. How do I know this isn't another manipulation? You don't, she stood. But can you afford not to hear me out? They walked through the gathering dusk. Margaret's voice low. What they showed you in interrogation, the real files, they're as false as what I showed you in the archives. What? Think about it. If they really had devastating proof about Moscow, why wait all these years? Why this elaborate setup? Don Jr.'s mind raced. Then what's the truth? The truth. Margaret smiled sadly. The truth is they don't know. Nobody does. Whatever happened in Moscow died with the people who were there. All these files, all these stories, they're just different agencies trying to claim they know more than they do. So this whole thing was about creating leverage where none existed, making you believe they had power over you. She stopped walking. The question is, well, what are you going to do with that information? Don Jr. stared at her. Why are you telling me this? Because I've spent 30 years watching agencies destroy people with secrets, real and invented. Maybe it's time someone fought back. She handed him a thumb drive. The actual Moscow files, everything we really know, everything we don't. Use it however you want. They'll know you gave this to me. I'm old, Mr. Trump, and tired. Maybe it's time for some truth, whatever the cost. She walked away, leaving Don Jr. holding the drive. His phone buzzed again. Mike, with the secure line ready. In a small electronics shop in Queens. Don Jr. stared at the burner phone. Time to call his father. But what would he say? The truth about Moscow was apparently as elusive as ever. But maybe that was the real story. How power worked in the shadows. How lies became weapons. How truth could be whatever those in control wanted it to be. He dialed Mar-a-Lago's private number, thinking about Margaret's words, about fighting back, about choosing your own truth. Dad, we need to talk, but not about what they want us to discuss. Asterisk. The secure phone line crackled as Don Jr. sat in his study. Margaret's thumb drive plugged into an air-gapped laptop. Mike stood guard at the door while Eric paced nearby. You're telling me? Eric ran his hands through his hair. That everything they showed you in the CIA archives was fake. And everything they showed you in interrogation was fake too, according to Margaret. Don Jr. scrolled through documents on the screen. But these files, they tell a completely different story. Can we trust her? Mike asked from the door. At this point, I don't know who we can trust. Don Jr. opened another folder. But these documents, they're unlike anything we've seen before. The phone rang. Ivanka calling through their secure channel. Don, her voice was tense. Secret Service just doubled their presence at Mar-a-Lago. Something's happening. They're making their move, Mike said. They must know about the thumb drive. Don Jr. typed faster, scanning through file after file. There's something here about a joint CIA MI6 operation. Code name, Mirror Dance. What does it say? Eric leaned over his shoulder. It's Don Jr.'s voice trailed off as he read. My God, they didn't just let people believe lies about Moscow. They actively created them. The documents detailed an elaborate deception campaign. The CIA and MI6 had manufactured the entire Moscow scandal, not to hide their extraction of a Russian asset, but to create a years-long political smokescreen. Listen to this, Don Jr. read aloud. Operation Mirror Dance successfully established. Multiple conflicting narratives regarding Trump's Moscow visit, each narrative engineered to be partially verifiable, while obscuring ongoing intelligence operations in the region. They made everyone focus on Dad while they ran other ops, Eric asked. Bigger than that, they created an unsolvable mystery. Every time someone thought they'd figured out what happened in Moscow, another piece of evidence would surface contradicting it. They kept everyone chasing their tails for years. Ivanka's voice came through the speaker. But why? Why go to all that trouble? Because a new voice said from the doorway, "Sometimes the best place to hide the truth is behind 1,000 lies." They spun to find Margaret Wells standing there, Mike's gun trained on her. "How did you get in here?" Don Jr. demanded. "The same way I got out of CIA custody." She stepped into the room. "They're not the only ones with resources." "Mike, it's okay." Don Jr. waved the gun down. I think she's really trying to help us." Margaret sat heavily in an armchair. "What you're reading, Operation Mirror Dance, it goes deeper than you imagine. The Moscow incident wasn't just about your father. It was about creating a permanent distraction, a political black hole that would keep swallowing up attention and resources for years. While they did what? While they restructured the entire intelligence apparatus of the Western world." She pulled out her own thumb drive. "This contains the full Mirror Dance files. What I gave you earlier was just the surface." Don Jr. stared at the new drive. "Why are you really helping us?" "Because I helped create this mess." Margaret's voice cracked. "I was young, ambitious. When they asked me to help architect the Moscow deception, it seemed like just another operation. I didn't realize we were building a machine that would destroy lives." "How high does this go?" Ivanka asked through the phone, all the way to the top. "Both sides of the aisle. The Moscow operation became too useful to too many people. A perfect political weapon, impossible to prove, impossible to disprove." Don Jr. opened the new files, documents, photos, internal memos, the full skeleton of a massive intelligence operation. "Look at this." He pointed to a memo. They had teams creating fake evidence, other teams debunking it. Every time the media got close to one story, they'd leak something supporting a different theory. "The perfect smokescreen." Margaret nodded. "While everyone obsessed over what your father did or didn't do in Moscow, nobody noticed the massive restructuring of international intelligence sharing, the new backdoors, the consolidated power." "And now," Eric asked, "why are they so desperate to control the narrative again?" "Because it's happening again. Another major intelligence reorganization is coming. They need the Moscow distraction more than ever." Don Jr.'s phone buzzed. A text from the CIA. "Time's running out. Mr. Trump, make the call. They're moving pieces into place," Margaret said. "Once they launch the next phase of Mirror Dance, the truth will be buried forever. So, what do we do?" Don Jr. looked at the faces around him. His brother, his trusted security advisor, the CIA archivist turned whistleblower, his sister on the secure line. "We could go public," Eric suggested. "They'd bury us in conflicting evidence." Margaret shook her head. "More leaks, more theories. The machine is too big. Unless..." Don Jr. studied the files. "Unless we don't play their game at all. What if instead of trying to prove what did or didn't happen in Moscow, we expose the operation itself?" Ivanka finished. "Show people how they've been manipulated." "It would mean admitting we never knew the Moscow truth," Eric said quietly. "That maybe we never will." Sometimes Margaret stood. "The biggest truth is admitting what we don't know." Don Jr. thought about his father, still waiting for answers, about the choice between comforting lies and complicated truths. "They're watching the building," Mike reported from the window. "Black SUVs on both corners." "They know what we have," Margaret said. "Once they realize I'm here too, we don't have much time." Don Jr. looked at the files that revealed not what happened in Moscow, but something perhaps more important, how truth itself had become a weapon. "Make copies," he ordered. "Multiple drives, different locations." "Eric, call our tech team." "Ivanka, we need secure servers ready." "What's the play?" Mike asked. "We're going to give them exactly what they fear most." Don Jr. started typing. "The truth about their lies." Margaret smiled sadly. "They'll come after us. All of us. Let them come." Don Jr. thought about years of watching his father twist in the wind of manufactured mysteries. It's time to break their machine. The room hummed with activity, copying files, establishing secure connections, preparing for the storm they were about to unleash outside. More black SUVs arrived. Don Jr.'s phone buzzed. One last time, the CIA's message simple, wrong choice. But for the first time since this began, he felt like he was finally making the right one. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Don Jr.'s apartment had transformed into a command center, with encrypted laptops, burner phones, and a growing team of trusted allies. "They're moving," Mike called from his surveillance position, to teams approaching the lobby. Another covering the service entrance. Margaret was organizing files on a secure server. "Once we release this, there's no going back. The entire intelligence community will come after us." "Let them," Don Jr. said, reviewing the mirror dance documents one last time. "Eric, are the servers ready?" Eric nodded, phone pressed to his ear. "Ivanka's team has mirror sites set up in 6 countries. The moment we go live, the files replicate everywhere." "Mr. Trump," Margaret touched his arm. "There's something else you need to see first." She pulled up a final folder labeled Kingmaker_protocol. Inside was a series of surveillance photos. His father in an unscheduled meeting, weeks before the Moscow trip. "That's Don Jr. leaned closer. That's Robert Sullivan. He's on Biden's national security team now. Keep reading." The documents showed a pattern of meetings, Trump Tower, private clubs, unmarked locations, all off the books, all before Moscow. Dad never mentioned any of this, because they erased it from his memory. Margaret said quietly, "The same way they've been editing reality for years." A commotion in the hallway interrupted them. Mike drew his weapon as the door burst open. FBI, everyone on the ground. Agents flooded the room, weapons drawn. Behind them came CIA Deputy Director Wilson and a man Don Jr. didn't recognize. "That's far enough," the stranger said, holding up a badge. "Robert Sullivan, National Security Council." Don Jr. felt ice in his veins. The same man from the photos. "Interesting timing," he said, standing slowly. "We were just reading about you." Sullivan smiled thinly. "I'm sure you were." Margaret's always had a flair for the dramatic. He turned to the archivist. "Hello, Meg. Still trying to save the world. Still trying to control it, Robert." "Control," Sullivan laughed. "We're trying to protect it. Do you have any idea what would happen if people knew how their reality was really shaped? The chaos it would cause. They deserve the truth," Don Jr. said. "Truth," Sullivan spat the word. "Truth is what we say it is. Your father understood that, even if he didn't know he understood it. What did you do to him?" "We helped him become what America needed. A perfect controversy. A walking, talking distraction while we rebuilt the world's intelligence infrastructure." Sullivan nodded to his agents. "Seize everything. Drives, phones, laptops." "Too late," Eric smiled, hitting a key on his laptop. "It's already out there." Alarms blared on the FBI agents' phones. Wilson cursed, checking his device. "Sir." He turned to Sullivan. "Mirror dance files are hitting the internet. Multiple sources. Our kill switches aren't working." Sullivan's facade cracked. "Shut it down. Shut it all down." "You can't," Margaret said. "Not this time. The truth is viral, Robert. You taught me that." Don Jr.'s phone rang. Mar-a-Lago's private line. Everyone in the room froze. "You should answer that." Margaret nodded. "I think your father's about to remember some very interesting things." Sullivan drew his weapon. "Don't you dare. Stand down, Robert." A new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. CIA Director Andrews stood there, flanked by military police. "That's enough, sir. I can explain. You can explain to the Oversight Committee." Andrews nodded to the MPs. "Take him, Wilson too," as they led Sullivan and Wilson away. Andrews turned to Don Jr. "Your father's memories should start returning within hours. The chemical suppressant they used, it wears off once the trigger phrase is deactivated." "You knew?" Don Jr. asked. "About all of it. I suspected. But Margaret brought me proof last week. We've been building a case, waiting for Sullivan to show his hand." Andrews smiled at the archivist. "Well played, Meg. Always have a backup plan." She shrugged. Don Jr.'s phone kept ringing. The truth about Moscow wasn't what anyone had thought. Not a Russian conspiracy. Not a CIA extraction, but something far stranger. A manufactured reality designed to hide an intelligence coup. "Answer it," Margaret urged. "Tell your father everything." As Don Jr. reached for the phone, Andrews added, "Mr. Trump, what your father did, what they made him forget, he was trying to stop them. Remember that." The phone felt heavy in his hand. Years of lies were about to unravel. But maybe that's what truth really was, not a single revelation, but the slow untangling of carefully woven deceptions. "Dad," he answered, "you're not going to believe what really happened." The Mar-a-Lago dining room was silent except for the gentle hum of air conditioning. Don Jr. sat across from his father, the damning photographs spread between them. The unscheduled meeting with Robert Sullivan weeks before Moscow. Proof of a conspiracy deeper than anyone had imagined. "I remember," Donald Trump said softly, touching one of the photos. "It's like a fog lifting. They came to me about Russia, said they needed my help. Why didn't you ever tell us?" "Because they made me forget." Trump's hands trembled slightly. "They used something on me, some kind of drug. Every time I tried to remember, it just slipped away." Eric paced behind them. "But why? Why go through all this trouble?" "Because Dad was going to expose them." Don Jr. realized, studying his father's face. "Weren't you?" Trump nodded slowly. "Sullivan. He wanted me to be part of their game, use my Moscow trip as cover for something bigger. But I found out what they were really planning. The intelligence reorganization, the backdoors, everything. I was going to go public. So they drugged you and turned you into their puppet instead." Don Jr.'s voice cracked with anger. "Made everyone think you were a Russian asset while they built their shadow empire." "Mr. Trump." Margaret Wells stepped forward from where she'd been quietly observing. "What exactly did you discover that made them take such extreme measures?" Trump closed his eyes, concentrating. "There was a document. Sullivan left it in the Trump Tower meeting room by accident. Something called Project Looking Glass." Margaret's face went pale. "You're sure about that name?" "What is it?" Eric asked. "The holy grail of intelligence operations." Margaret sat heavily. "A decades-long plan to create a unified global surveillance network. Every agency, every country, all feeding into one system. Total information awareness. And Moscow was just a distraction?" Don Jr. asked. "To keep people from noticing while they built this thing, not just Moscow." Trump stood, walking to the window. "Everything. The conspiracies, the investigations, the endless scandals. They needed the world focused on me instead of what they were doing behind the scenes." A security guard appeared at the door. "Sir, CNN is reporting on the mirror dance files. They're calling it the biggest intelligence scandal in history." Don Jr. checked his phone. Hundreds of notifications. The story was exploding across every network. "They'll try to contain this," Margaret warned. "They still have assets everywhere. People who benefit from the system they built. Let them try." Trump turned from the window, and for the first time in years, Don Jr. saw real fire in his father's eyes. "We have something they don't." "What's that?" "The truth. The real truth." He picked up the photo of his meeting with Sullivan. "And now, thanks to my son, I remember everything." The door burst open as Ivanka rushed in, tablet in hand. "You need to see this. Sullivan's been arrested. He's talking to prosecutors." They gathered around the tablet, watching the breaking news coverage. Sullivan being led into FBI headquarters in handcuffs, Wilson right behind him. "It's not over," Margaret cautioned. "Looking Glass is still out there, still operating." "Then we shut it down." Don Jr. stood. "All of it. The fake narratives, the manipulated realities, everything they built on lies." Trump touched his son's shoulder. "They'll come after us, hard. Once people realize how long they've been manipulated. Let them come." Don Jr. thought about the past few days, breaking into the CIA, discovering layers of deception, finally understanding the true game. "We've spent years defending ourselves against fake scandals. Time to fight a real one." Ivanka's tablet chimed with more alerts. The story was going global. Intelligence agencies worldwide were facing questions about their involvement in Mirror Dance. "Dad," she said quietly, "they're calling for you to speak. People want to know the truth about Moscow." Trump stood silent for a long moment, staring at the photos of his forgotten meeting with Sullivan. The truth is I tried to stop them. And when I couldn't," he looked at his son, "you finished what I started." Don Jr. felt the weight of the moment. They'd gone looking for answers about Moscow and found something far bigger, a system of control and manipulation that had shaped world events for years. "Sir, Aid rushed in. "The president is calling, and the British Prime Minister. Everyone wants answers." "Give them to me." Trump straightened his tie. "All of them. It's time to tell the real story." As their father left to face the media storm, Don Jr. turned to Margaret. "What happens now?" She gathered the photographs and documents. Now. We follow Looking Glass. We expose every piece of their machine. And we hope what? Hope that the truth really does set us free." She smiled sadly. "Even when it's not the truth we expected to find." Outside, they could hear the growing crowd of reporters. The world was about to change, not because of what did or didn't happen in Moscow, but because someone finally exposed the strings that had been pulling everyone's puppets. Don Jr.'s phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "You don't know what you've started." He looked at his family, at Margaret, at the evidence of decades of manipulation spread across the table. "No," he typed back, "but I know how it ends. The truth about Moscow wasn't what anyone had thought. It was bigger, darker, and more dangerous than a simple scandal. But maybe that's what they needed all along. Not just answers about one night in Russia, but the courage to tear down the whole house of lies." Trump's voice boomed from the press room. "My fellow Americans, today we're going to talk about truth. Real truth. And how it's been hidden from all of us." Don Jr. squared his shoulders. The real fight was just beginning, but for the first time in years, they were fighting with the most powerful weapon of all, the truth. No matter what came next, there was no going back. The looking glass had shattered, and reality itself was spilling through the cracks. The global response was immediate and seismic. As Trump's press conference played on every major network, Don Jr. watched the headlines roll across his phone. "Intelligence community in chaos. Global surveillance program exposed. Operation Looking Glass. The real Moscow conspiracy multiple. Intelligence officials arrested in worldwide sweep." Margaret worked furiously at her laptop, tracking the fallout. "Intelligence agencies worldwide are going into lockdown. Servers being wiped. Files destroyed. Can they hide it?" Eric asked. "Too late," she smiled. "We planted copies everywhere. The more they try to erase, the more attention they draw." Ivanka burst in, phone to her ear. "The Senate Intelligence Committee is calling an emergency session. They want Dad to testify, sir." Mike appeared at the door. "We've got movement. Multiple agencies trying to access the property." Don Jr. looked out the window. Black SUVs were gathering at the Mar-a-Lago. Gates, lights flashing. "Let them come," Trump said, returning from the press room. "We've got nothing left to hide." The phone lines were ringing non-stop. World leaders, intelligence officials, media, everyone demanding answers about Looking Glass. "Mr. President," Aid rushed in, "Moscow is on the line. The Russians, they're claiming they were victims too, that Looking Glass was used against them." "Of course they were," Margaret said. "That was the brilliance of it. Every country thought they were playing the others, but Sullivan's group was playing them all." Trump took the Russian call in his office while Don Jr. and the others monitored the growing crisis. The truth about Moscow had evolved into something far beyond what anyone had imagined. Not a scandal about one man, but a revelation about how the modern world really worked. "We're getting reports," Eric read from his tablet, "of intelligence officers coming forward worldwide. Whistleblowers exposing Looking Glass operations in their countries. The dam is breaking." Margaret nodded. "Once people realize how deep the manipulation went." A commotion at the gate interrupted them. FBI Director Marshall himself was demanding entry. "Let him in," Trump ordered, returning from his call. "Time to end this properly." Marshall entered with a full tactical team, but Trump waved them back. "Sit down, John. Let's talk about what Looking Glass really was." The FBI director looked aged. "Defeated. You have no idea what you've done. The system, it kept the peace, kept the balance. Through lies," Don Jr. challenged. "Through manufactured realities, through control." Marshall shot back. "Do you know what happens now? Every conspiracy theory, every fringe group, they'll claim validation. The world order itself could collapse. Maybe it needs to," Trump said quietly. "Maybe we need to build something new, something based on truth." Marshall laughed bitterly. "Truth? There's a reason we built Looking Glass. People can't handle the real truth. That's not your decision to make. Margaret stepped forward. Not anymore. More cars were arriving. CIA, NSA, Foreign Intelligence Services. Mar-a-Lago was becoming ground zero. For a global reckoning, Don Jr.'s phone buzzed, a video call from Moscow. The Russian president himself, looking shaken. "We must talk," he said without preamble. "About everything. No more games, no more shadows." Trump took the phone. "That's why we're here. Total transparency, starting now." As his father began coordinating with world leaders, Don Jr. stepped onto the balcony. The morning sun was rising. Over Palm Beach, cameras flashing below as reporters gathered. Margaret joined him. Having regrets about exposing the truth? Never. He watched another convoy of government vehicles approach. About what comes next, maybe. The world's changing, she agreed. Once people understand how Looking Glass worked, how it shaped everything from politics to culture, we'll handle it, Don Jr. said firmly. Together. No more puppet masters, no more manufactured realities. Inside, they could hear Trump's voice rising. The American people deserve to know every detail, every operation. The truth about Moscow had led them somewhere none of them expected. But maybe that's what truth really was, not a destination, but a journey, one that never really ended. Don Jr.'s phone buzzed one last time. A message from an unknown number. "You've torn down our system. What will you build in its place?" He looked at his family, at Margaret, at the gathering forces of a world in transformation. "Something better," he typed back. "Something real." The sun climbed higher as sirens wailed in the distance. The old world of shadows and lies was ending. What would replace it? Only time would tell. But at least now they could face it with clear eyes and clean consciences. The truth, in all its complexity, was finally free, and that was just the beginning.